The army sent me home early. I walked in. My wife was in bed with my brother, still wearing our wedding ring. When the army sent me home early, I thought it was the best surprise I could ever give her. The message came down 2 weeks before schedule, a logistics delay, routine paperwork, and suddenly I was cleared to fly home. After nearly 10 months stationed in Kuwait, I couldn't stop picturing Tessa's face when she saw me walk through that door. She hated long deployments, hated the silence, hated how the house felt empty without me. Or at least that's what she told me in her letters. The flight landed at dawn in Atlanta. I picked up my duffel, still covered in desert dust, and caught the earliest bus toward home. It was a 3-hour ride through humid countryside and flat farmland, the kind of quiet that made you realize how far you were from the noise of a base. I kept thinking about her text the week before, the one where she said she missed falling asleep next to me. She had attached a picture of our dog, Cooper, lying on my side of the bed. By the time I reached our small town, it was past noon. I stopped at a gas station near the edge of town, bought a cheap bouquet of wildflowers, and grabbed one of those cold bottled coffees. I remember looking in the mirror above the sink and laughing. I hadn't shaved properly in weeks, my hair was too short, my uniform smelled like airplane air, and I still thought she'd jump into my arms the second she saw me. The neighborhood was quiet when I pulled into the driveway. Her car was there, the same old silver sedan with a small dent in the bumper. Cooper wasn't barking, which was strange. He always went wild when he heard the sound of my truck. I figured maybe she took him for a walk or was still asleep, so I parked quietly and carried my duffel to the porch. The curtains were drawn tight, even though the afternoon sun was bright. Something inside me paused then. It wasn't fear, not yet. Just a flicker of discomfort, like walking into a familiar room and realizing one detail is off. I tried to convince myself she was napping, or maybe sick. The door was unlocked. I stepped in, expecting the faint scent of her vanilla candles or the dog sprinting toward me. Instead, I smelled perfume, heavy, recent, and the faint sound of music from upstairs. Cooper wasn't there. The leash was hanging by the door, untouched. I placed the flowers on the table and started up the stairs quietly, instinctively moving the way soldiers do when they're not sure what's waiting ahead. The music grew clearer, soft, rhythmic, and not something she ever played. My stomach turned before my mind even accepted what it could mean. At the top of the stairs, the bedroom door was open just a crack. I could see movement through it, shadows shifting, a hand brushing against the curtain. Then I saw something that stopped me. My army sweatshirt, the one Tessa used to wear around the house, crumpled on the chair beside the bed. Next to it, my brother's leather watch, unmistakable. He had worn it since high school, engraved with our father's initials. The sound of laughter followed, soft at first, then clearer. 2 voices, hers and his. And just like that, everything fell apart. I didn't burst in. I didn't yell. I didn't even open the door. I just stood there, my hand on the wall, watching the edge of that reflection in the mirror. Her hair, his shoulder, the rhythm of something that should have been mine. She was still wearing our wedding ring. It caught the light as she moved, a thin circle of gold that suddenly meant nothing. The human mind has strange ways of protecting itself. Mine detached. I felt my body tense, but my thoughts floated somewhere above it, as if watching through a fog. Every sound, the creak of the bed, the laugh, the whisper, registered too clearly. I stepped back, one careful foot after another, until I reached the hallway. Then I turned and walked down the stairs. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word. I just left. The air outside felt heavier than the desert heat I'd left behind. I sat in my truck for a long time, not moving, not even starting the engine. My heart wasn't racing. It was too slow, too steady. I stared at the house, the curtains, the parked car, the flowers wilting already in the warm air. I thought about how many times I'd pictured coming home. Never once had I imagined this. At some point, I started driving without knowing where. The road cut through the same fields I'd grown up around, golden and quiet, but everything looked wrong. Every mile I drove made me realize there was no home waiting for me anymore. I reached the next county before I finally stopped at a small rest area by the interstate. I parked near the edge of the lot where a few trucks sat idling. I turned off my phone. The Army's discipline drilled into me to think rationally, to assess and plan, but that part of me felt broken. I couldn't call anyone, not my parents, not my commander, not even my best friend. I couldn't put words to what had happened. Night came slowly, the orange sky fading over the horizon. I stayed in the truck, the flowers still lying on the passenger seat. They smelled sweet and bitter, like something from a different life. I kept replaying everything in my head, the way her hand moved, the familiar watch, the ring flashing in the mirror. I tried to remember the last real conversation we'd had before deployment. It was about bills, small things, groceries. She had said she'd be fine, that she'd keep busy with her art classes. My brother, Mason, had promised to check in on her sometimes. He lived just 20 minutes away. He had said it casually, over a beer, as if it were nothing. I thanked him. It all seemed harmless back then. He'd always been the charming one. Easy smile, easy lies. He'd borrowed money from me before, a few thousand for his auto repair business. I hadn't cared. He was family. He'd been there when our father died. He'd carried the coffin with me. The idea that the same man could be upstairs with my wife while I was halfway across the world never crossed my mind. By midnight, I still hadn't moved. The truck's clock glowed faint blue, counting hours I couldn't feel. I opened the glove compartment, pulled out my old service pistol, unloaded, and just stared at it. It wasn't about violence. It was about control. Something solid to hold when everything else had collapsed. I put it back carefully. Sleep didn't come. I watched the highway lights pass, one by one, and thought about what came next. Part of me wanted to go back and confront them. Another part wanted to disappear entirely, file for transfer, take a post overseas, vanish into work where I didn't have to think. But even as I tried to plan, the image of them kept returning. That watch, that ring. When dawn broke again, I finally started the truck. I drove to a small diner outside town, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and used the restroom sink to wash my face. I looked like a stranger, pale, distant, older. The waitress asked if I was traveling through. I said yes. She smiled, not knowing that I hadn't been home for years, not really. Before leaving, I called a friend from base, Daryl, and told him I'd be taking personal leave. I didn't explain why. He asked if everything was fine. I said yes, lying so smoothly it scared me. On the way back toward town, I stopped at the animal shelter. Cooper wasn't home last night, and something told me she might have brought him here temporarily. I was right. They said a woman had dropped him off earlier that week, claiming she was moving. I signed the papers, and he came running out of the back room, tail wagging like nothing had changed. I envied that simplicity. I drove him to an old cabin my friend let me use for hunting trips. It sat near a small lake, quiet and far from neighbors. I unpacked the bare essentials, clothes, a few rations, my service gear, and sat on the porch with Cooper beside me. It wasn't peace I felt. It was something colder, steadier. The kind of silence that follows a storm but doesn't promise sunshine. I told myself I'd stay a few days, clear my head, figure out what to do. But I already knew I couldn't go back to that house. I couldn't look at her or him without seeing the mirror reflection burned into my memory. That night, I opened my laptop for the first time since returning. The home Wi-Fi automatically connected. I hadn't thought to change the password. Out of habit, I checked our joint bank account to see if the mortgage payment had gone through. The number on the screen froze me again. It wasn't what I expected. It was less. Much less. Half the balance was gone. The date of withdrawal matched exactly 1 week before my flight home. The one she didn't know about. I stared at it for a long time, feeling that same slow, steady heartbeat again. I didn't rage, didn't panic. I just understood, finally, that what happened upstairs wasn't a mistake. It was part of something bigger. I shut the laptop, sat back, and let the lake wind cool the sweat from my neck. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. Whatever they had done, whatever they thought they could get away with, I would find out. Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. And when I did, I wasn't going to yell or break things. I was going to make sure they lost everything, the way they had stripped everything from me. I stayed at the cabin for days without counting them. The rhythm of morning light and evening dark was enough. Cooper and I fell into silence. He hunted frogs by the lake while I sat on the porch, trying to understand how a life could collapse so neatly. I told myself I was thinking clearly, but it was more like standing in smoke and convincing myself I could still breathe. At first, I thought the missing money was an accident, maybe a wrong transfer, maybe Tessa had paid off a debt. But that illusion cracked fast. I called the bank, pretending calm. The woman on the phone read the authorization log. A joint withdrawal, approved by both account holders. Then she said a name I hadn't expected. Mason. She said it so casually, I almost didn't react. Mason had been added as a secondary signatory 2 months ago. The authorization had been notarized by Tessa. That single sentence changed the air around me. It meant everything. The money, the timing, the silence. It meant they'd been working together long before I came home. I thanked the woman, hung up, and stared at the lake. The reflection of the sky looked like a wound opening over water. When I left the Army, I'd planned to start a small business, maybe a repair garage, maybe equipment maintenance. That money was my seed. It was the one stable thing after years of rotating bases and desert heat. Now it was gone, transferred under my own name, but controlled by the 2 people I trusted most. I drove back into town 2 days later. I didn't go home. I parked near Main Street and sat outside Mason's shop, a modest auto garage he'd opened last year. The sign above the door still had my handwriting on it. I'd helped him paint it one summer weekend. I noticed the new set of tools by the window, high-end imports, far beyond what he could afford when he started. Inside, I saw him laughing with a customer, moving like a man who didn't know he'd burned his last bridge. For a second, I almost wanted to storm in, to make it physical, to put my hands on him. But that would have been too easy for him. People like Mason never learned from confrontation, only from consequence. Instead, I waited until the shop closed. When the lights went out, I followed him from a distance, just to see. He drove not home, but to my house. Her house now, maybe. His car idled in the driveway before he went inside. No hesitation. I sat there for half an hour, headlights off, until I saw the upstairs light flicker on. The same window where I'd seen that reflection days before. The sight didn't sting anymore. It burned clean, a new kind of focus I hadn't felt in years. When I returned to the cabin, I opened my laptop again. This time, I searched every joint account, every shared document, every tax form. It didn't take long to find what I needed. She'd refinanced the house 3 months ago. The signature line was mine, but I'd been in the Middle East. They hadn't just betrayed me. They'd used my absence to build something for themselves. The garage, the money, the loan, all of it under the same quiet cooperation. I printed everything and spread it across the table. Each paper felt heavier than it should have. A map of how they'd used me while pretending to miss me. I drove to my friend Daryl's that night. He lived an hour north and worked in logistics now, civilian side. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, then careful, the way soldiers do when they see something off. He didn't ask many questions, just poured coffee and waited. I told him pieces, not everything. Enough for him to understand. He knew a guy in finance who'd done contract work for military cases, fraud, embezzlement, identity theft. Within a day, they traced the chain of transactions. Mason's business license listed my name as guarantor. My deployment bonus was used as collateral. All signed, notarized, processed clean. The fraud expert told me something that stuck. You don't fight this with emotion. You let it hang itself with paperwork. That's what I decided to do. I filed a report for suspected identity misuse and fraud through my military benefits liaison, then sent a private claim to the state attorney's office. Everything moved quietly. Paper trails don't make noise until they close around a throat. Meanwhile, I returned to the cabin, living in waiting. Every day, I ran scenarios in my head. What they might say, how they'd react when the truth surfaced. I rehearsed conversations I knew I'd never actually have. Then one evening, I got a message from Tessa. Short, cautious. She asked if I was okay, said she'd heard I came home early, that she wanted to talk. That word looked hollow on the screen. Still, I answered. I told her I needed to see her. She suggested the house. When I walked in again, everything looked staged. The candles, the new curtains, the faint smell of air freshener trying to cover something sour. She looked startled, nervous, but not remorseful. She talked too much, the way people do when they're afraid of silence. I let her speak, nodding at the right moments. Mason wasn't there. She said he was at the shop late, catching up on work. I told her I forgave her. I didn't mean it, but I said it like I did. She looked relieved, even touched. She asked if I'd move back in. I said maybe. That word was enough. I stayed that night, not sleeping much. The next morning, I drove into town before sunrise. The streets were empty, the air cold enough to bite. I parked across from the garage again. Mason's truck was already there. I watched him through the frosted windshield, pacing, checking his phone, restless. Around 7, 2 unmarked cars pulled up beside him. 3 men got out, suits instead of uniforms. They talked briefly, then one of them gestured toward the shop. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Mason's body stiffen. A few minutes later, he was in handcuffs. The police cars arrived next, their lights spinning across the storefront glass. The shop door was locked behind them as they led him away. I didn't move. I didn't celebrate. I just watched as they drove off. By noon, Tessa called me. Her voice cracked between confusion and fear. She said men came asking questions, that they'd taken Mason, that they mentioned my name. I told her I didn't know anything, that I'd just come back to rebuild things, same as her. She didn't believe me entirely, but she wanted to. People like her always want an easier lie. That night, I sat on the cabin porch again, Cooper at my feet, the lake still and dark. I thought about how fast everything had shifted. Less than 2 weeks ago, I'd been dreaming about surprising her with flowers. Now her lover, my brother, was behind bars, and she was next in line for interrogation. I expected relief, maybe satisfaction. What I felt instead was emptiness edged with curiosity. What else had they hidden? How deep did it go? Because even after the arrest, one thing didn't make sense. The forged documents had multiple notarizations, meaning she'd been there for every one of them. Yet when questioned later, she claimed ignorance, saying Mason handled all finances. But her signature was on every form. That's when I realized the story wasn't over. Not for them. and not for me. I had set the trap, but now I wanted to know just how willingly she'd walked into it. And I wasn't planning to stop until I knew. When Mason was arrested, I thought it would end there. A single clean break, justice served, and silence following after. But life never closes that neatly. By the third day, the story spread through town like gasoline catching fire. People talked in grocery aisles, whispered outside the mechanic's shop. Some said Mason had been caught laundering Army funds. Others said I'd framed him. Tessa stopped answering calls. Her car sat untouched in the driveway, blinds drawn. For a while, I let her be. Watching from a distance gave me a strange comfort. She didn't know what was coming next, and I didn't want her to. A week later, I received a call from the investigator assigned to the case, a man named Wilkes from the Financial Crimes Division. He spoke in the dry tone of someone who had seen too much paperwork and too little truth. He said Mason was cooperating, that he'd named Tessa as the notary for every forged signature and as a willing participant. They were cross-referencing statements. He wanted to confirm my deployment records to finalize the fraud timeline. That meant one thing: the case was airtight. Still, I didn't celebrate. The Army teaches you that victory is temporary. You can win a battle and lose everything else if you get comfortable. 2 days later, I went back to the house. I didn't announce it this time. When she opened the door, she looked smaller somehow. Makeup gone, eyes swollen. The house smelled like stale wine and air freshener. She asked if I'd heard anything about Mason. I said no, pretending ignorance. She seemed relieved, as if I was her only safe point now. I told her I wanted to make things right, that maybe we could talk things through. The lie came easy, smoother than I expected. She hesitated, studied my face, then nodded. The next few days felt like playing chess with a ghost. We spoke more, moved carefully around the subject of betrayal. She cried once at night when she thought I was asleep. I didn't comfort her. I wanted her guilt to stay sharp. I started noticing small details again: bills stacked on the table, new credit cards, letters from lawyers. Each piece told me what she wasn't saying. The house was already half under investigation, though she didn't know it yet. The financial division had frozen the joint account and placed a temporary hold on assets connected to Mason's business. Her comfortable world was collapsing in slow motion. I helped her cook one evening. She talked about selling the house, said she couldn't handle the attention, couldn't stand being the woman who ruined 2 brothers. I said nothing, but I was listening. Selling meant panic. She was scared, and fear made people careless. Later that night, she took a call outside. She thought I was upstairs, but I heard everything from the hallway. Her voice was low but frantic. She said something about needing to move money before it's locked up. Whoever was on the other end gave her instructions. She agreed to meet at the bank first thing Monday. I didn't intervene. I wanted her to hang herself with her own rope. The next morning, I left before dawn and drove to the bank. I met with the fraud investigator, Wilkes, and told him what I overheard. He said they were already monitoring the account, that if she tried to move funds, it would trigger the system immediately. He looked at me for a long moment before saying quietly, "You understand this will finish her, right?" I said I understood. When I got back home, she was on the phone again, dressed like she was heading somewhere formal. She jumped when she saw me, then forced a smile. Said she was going to sort some things out. I told her to take her time. By noon, I got the call from Wilkes. She tried to withdraw from a secondary line connected to Mason's company, one that had already been flagged as fraudulent. The attempt locked her out and notified the authorities automatically. An hour later, they came for her too. The image stayed burned in my head. Her standing on the porch in that same pale sweater, hair undone, trying to explain something that no longer mattered. She saw me watching from the truck, eyes widening with realization that I had known all along. For a moment, I thought she might run. But she didn't. She just froze, the way people do when they've lost every option. When they drove off, I sat there until the sun went down. The house stood quiet, stripped of warmth. Cooper whined in the back seat, restless. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare key, the one I'd kept since before deployment, and placed it on the porch rail. I wasn't coming back again. That night at the cabin, I went through everything one last time. The documents, the case files, the bank records. I didn't keep them as trophies. I kept them as proof that I hadn't imagined it. That the people who said they loved me had actually built an entire scheme while pretending to miss me. I thought that would give me peace. It didn't. The silence after revenge is heavier than the noise before it. There's no satisfaction in it. Only the hollow realization that nothing can undo what was already taken. Weeks passed before the hearing. Mason's lawyer argued for leniency, claiming financial stress and poor judgment. Tessa's defense was that she'd been manipulated. She cried in court, spoke about loneliness, about not understanding the documents she'd signed. But Wilkes presented time-stamped records, emails, and deposit slips all in her handwriting. The evidence crushed her story completely. Mason was sentenced first, 18 months in prison for fraud, forgery, and misuse of federal benefits. Tessa's sentence came 2 weeks later, 12 months of probation, financial restitution, and permanent ineligibility for joint accounts involving federal funds. They called it justice. To me, it just felt like paperwork with a pulse. After the sentencing, I visited Mason once, not for closure, but because I wanted to see what kind of man could do this to his own blood. The prison visitation room was cold, metallic, full of fluorescent hums. He looked older, unshaven, and yet his eyes still carried that same flicker of arrogance. He started talking the second he saw me. Said Tessa had turned on him, that she'd made deals to reduce her sentence, that she was pretending to be the victim now. He said I'd destroyed the family, that I'd made him look like a criminal when it was just bad luck. I let him talk. When he stopped, I asked one question, when it started. He didn't answer. He looked away, shoulders tight, jaw clenching. That silence was worth more than any confession. It told me everything. It had started long before I left for Kuwait. Before I stood, he said something that stuck with me. He said she'd visited him last week, crying, saying she was pregnant, that it might be mine. It was the only time I felt something pierce through the calm I'd built. I walked out without responding, the sound of his laughter following me to the door. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake it. The timeline made no sense. I'd only been home a month, and she'd already been with him before. Still, the thought crawled through me, cold and steady. When the official notice came from the courthouse about asset recovery, there was also a sealed envelope from Tessa. Inside was a short letter written in her shaky handwriting. She said she was sorry, said she'd lost everything, that she didn't expect forgiveness but hoped I'd believe she never meant for things to go so far. At the bottom, she mentioned the baby again, said she would keep it, no matter what. For a few hours, I believed her. Then I requested a DNA test through a mutual contact. 3 weeks later, the results arrived. It was Mason's. I remember setting the envelope down on the table, staring at the lake outside, and feeling nothing. No rage, no shock, just an odd clarity. It was as if every piece had finally settled where it belonged. The betrayal, the lies, the fraud, the child, all part of the same pattern. That night, I packed what was left of my gear and drove to the Army base 2 hours south. I signed up for voluntary reassignment overseas. When they asked why, I said I needed distance. They didn't question it. The Army accepted my reassignment within a week. They didn't press for details, and I didn't offer any. My record was clean, my service still valued, and they were short-staffed overseas. I was sent to a logistics post in northern Italy, quiet, efficient, far from everything that used to matter. I didn't leave a forwarding address. The first few months were mechanical. Wake before dawn, run drills, manage supplies, oversee equipment inventories. There was comfort in the repetition, in the certainty of routine. No one asked about Tessa or Mason, and I didn't mention them. I let the past fade, piece by piece, until it existed only in fragments. The flash of her wedding ring, the watch on his wrist, the silence of that house when I walked away. But life doesn't let go just because you stop looking back. It has a way of sending echoes long after you've left the room. The first echo came as a letter. Official envelope, U.S. return address, forwarded through military channels. Inside was a notice from the court. Mason had filed an appeal. He claimed new evidence. He said the loans were approved by verbal agreement, that I'd implicitly consented, while deployed, that there was no intent to defraud. It was nonsense, but legally he had the right to try. I should have ignored it, but curiosity pulled me under. I contacted Wilkes, the investigator back in Georgia. He was blunt as ever. The appeal wouldn't go anywhere, he said. The documents were too clear, the timeline too precise. Mason's lawyer was using it as leverage to negotiate early release or work detail privileges. But then Wilkes paused, his tone shifting. He said Tessa had visited Mason again, this time bringing the baby. She'd named the child Evan, after our late father. I didn't react at first. The name hung between us like static. Wilkes said she was living in a rented apartment near the edge of town, barely getting by, working as a receptionist at a dentist's office. Mason was due for parole review in 6 months. I ended the call before Wilkes could say more. That night, I sat outside the barracks smoking a cigarette, watching fog roll through the mountains. The irony hit slowly. She'd taken everything from me, and still, she'd tried to tie the child to my bloodline through a name. Whether it was guilt or arrogance, I couldn't tell. A week later, I got another letter. This time, handwritten. It was from her. The words were uneven, desperate. She said she knew I hated her, but she wanted me to know Mason was out soon. She said he blamed me for ruining his life, and that he'd been talking about making things right. She begged me not to come back, not to get involved. She said she was scared of him now. I folded the letter once and put it in my duffel. For a few days, I convinced myself it wasn't my problem. But some things don't rest, especially when blood is involved. 2 months later, Mason was released early on good behavior. I didn't find out from Wilkes this time. I found out when a photo landed in my inbox from an old friend back home. A picture of Mason standing outside his shop, the one he no longer owned, the building boarded up, spray-painted with thief. The caption read, "He's back. Looks rough." I stared at it for a long time. He looked thinner, angrier, but alive, the kind of man who believed the world owed him something. I knew then it wasn't over. By the time spring came, I requested short leave and booked a flight back to the States. It wasn't revenge pulling me anymore. It was instinct, the same one that kept me alive during combat. You don't turn your back on unfinished threats. Georgia hadn't changed. The streets looked smaller, the people slower, but the tension in the air felt the same. I rented a car and drove past the old neighborhood. The house had a new family in it. The porch was painted blue. Cooper's old leash still hung on the fence post like an artifact. Tessa's apartment was on the outskirts, low brick building, dull parking lot, the kind of place where every door looked the same. I parked and waited, not sure if I wanted to see her or just confirm she still existed. She came out carrying groceries, the baby in a carrier on her chest. She looked tired, pale skin, hollow eyes, moving like someone whose days had become survival. I stayed in the car. Watching was enough. But then I saw Mason's truck. Same one as before, dented fender, mismatched door. He pulled up fast, blocking her car in. She froze when she saw him. They argued, not loud enough to hear, but I could see her hands shaking. He gestured toward the baby, shouting something that made her flinch. Without thinking, I stepped out. Old habits die hard. When danger starts, you move. I approached just as Mason turned and noticed me. For a second, everything stilled. His face changed, surprise first, then rage. He called out my name, walking toward me with that same swagger he'd always used to hide weakness. He asked what I was doing there, why I couldn't let the past die. His words blurred together, spilling anger and self-pity. I didn't raise my voice. I told him to leave her alone. He laughed, a sound too sharp, too bitter. He said she'd ruined both of us, that she didn't deserve anything. Then he said something colder, that maybe the baby didn't either. That's when I hit him. Not hard, not like a soldier, just enough to shut him up. He stumbled, grabbed my jacket, tried to swing back. The fight lasted seconds. He ended up on the ground, breathless, cursing. Tessa screamed for him to stop, but he was already done. He got up, spat at the ground near my feet, and walked away, muttering that this wasn't finished. I didn't follow. I helped her pick up the spilled groceries. She didn't thank me, didn't speak. She just looked at me like I was a ghost. I told her I wasn't staying, that I only came to make sure she and the child were safe. She nodded, too drained to argue. That night, I stayed at a motel outside town. The next morning, I got a call from Wilkes again. He said Mason had been picked up near the old shop, drunk, carrying a stolen tool set from another garage. Back in custody. Probation violated. It was over this time, truly over. I left town that same day. Before driving to the airport, I stopped by the lake near the cabin. The trees were bare, the water still. I stood there for a long while, trying to remember the man I'd been before all of this. The version who believed home was something permanent. You can lose your house, your money, even your name for a while. But the worst thing you can lose is the sense that your life belongs to you. For months, it hadn't. They'd written my story for me. But standing there, wind biting at my face, I realized I finally had it back. When I returned to Italy, the air felt different. The barracks didn't seem so sterile anymore. I worked harder, took new assignments, rebuilt myself through motion. One day, I got a final letter, not from her, not from him, but from the state. The fraud recovery had been settled. The rest of the money was donated under my name to the Veterans Housing Project. The letter ended with a small note from Wilkes. She moved away. Different state. The kid's healthy. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and locked it in the drawer with my service papers. Years later, people would ask me why I never remarried, why I stayed abroad so long. I always gave the same answer. The army felt easier than love. At least here, betrayal had rules, and you could see it coming. Still, sometimes at night, when the air was quiet and the mountains turned silver under moonlight, I'd think about Mason. About how two boys who shared a room and a name could end up enemies over the same woman. About how she probably told the child stories that erased me entirely. And I'd think about that day I came home early, about the sound of laughter behind a half-open door, the glint of a ring in sunlight. That was the moment my real life began, not the one I'd built, but the one I had to rebuild from ashes. And in a strange way, I was grateful for it. Because sometimes the only way to know who you are is to lose everything that ever told you.